Natalie Brooks pressed her forehead against the cold window of her cramped apartment and watched the rain pour down on the city below. 24 years old with a pristine biology degree, and she could barely afford groceries. The irony tasted bitter on her tongue. Her phone displayed another rejection email and she deleted it without reading past the first line. 6 months of searching had left her with nothing but a soul-crushing waitressing job and debts that grew larger each day. The stack of bills on her kitchen counter seemed to mock her every time she walked past. Student loans demanded payments she could not make. Her landlord had already warned her twice about late rent. The electricity company sent a final notice yesterday. Natalie felt like she was sinking into quicksand, and every attempt to climb out only pulled her deeper. She had worked so hard through college and sacrificed everything for a future that now seemed like a cruel joke. The unexpected call. Her phone rang with an unfamiliar number and Natalie almost sent it to voicemail. Debt collectors had become her most frequent callers. But something made her swipe to answer, and a crisp professional voice greeted her. The woman introduced herself as Victoria Sterling from Meridian Research Group. Natalie racked her brain trying to remember if she had applied there. The past months had been a blur of applications sent to hundreds of companies in desperate hope. Victoria explained that they had reviewed Natalie's academic credentials and were impressed by her research thesis on cellular regeneration. They wanted to interview her for a position that matched her qualifications perfectly. Then Victoria mentioned the salary and Natalie had to sit down. The number was staggering. More money than she had ever imagined earning in her first year out of college. Enough to pay off her debts and actually live instead of merely surviving. The interview was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon at an address in the wealthy district where Natalie had never ventured. She agreed immediately and her hands trembled as she ended the call. Hope felt dangerous after so many disappointments, but she could not help the flutter of excitement in her chest. Maybe her luck was finally changing. Maybe all the struggle had been leading to this moment. The gleaming tower. Natalie stood before the building the next day and felt completely out of place. The structure rose like a crystal monument to wealth and power. Her interview outfit looked shabby despite her best efforts to appear professional. She straightened her shoulders and walked through doors that whispered open at her approach. The lobby was all polished stone and modern sculpture. Everything screamed money in a language she barely understood. Victoria Sterling appeared exactly on time. She was elegant and poised with silver hair styled perfectly and eyes that seemed to catalog everything at a glance. She led Natalie to a private elevator that climbed silently to the top floor. The office suite made Natalie feel like she had stepped into another world. Windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering views that took her breath away. The furniture looked like it cost more than her entire education. The strange interview. Victoria gestured to a chair that felt like sitting on a cloud and the interview began. But these were not normal questions. Victoria asked about ethics and loyalty. She probed into how Natalie handled secrets and whether she could work without asking questions. The questions felt odd and slightly unsettling, but Natalie needed this opportunity desperately. She answered carefully and emphasized her discretion and focus. Her ability to separate personal curiosity from professional responsibility. After nearly 2 hours, Victoria leaned forward with an expression that mixed assessment with something like sympathy. She explained that this position required absolute confidentiality. The work would be sensitive and sometimes unusual. Natalie would sign a comprehensive agreement preventing her from discussing anything she saw or heard. The consequences for breaking that agreement would be severe both legally and financially. Natalie felt unease creep up her spine, but she pushed it down. Every job had requirements and this seemed reasonable for sensitive research. The binding document. Victoria produced a folder thick with documents and placed it between them. The confidentiality agreement was massive. Page after page of legal language that made Natalie's eyes blur. She tried to read carefully, but the terminology was dense and complicated. Victoria assured her it was standard protection for proprietary research. The salary figure at the top kept drawing Natalie's attention. That number represented freedom from the suffocating pressure of debt. It represented the life she had worked so hard to build. Natalie thought of the threatening letters at home. The feeling of drowning while everyone else seemed to swim effortlessly through life. Her hand moved almost automatically and she signed her name on every marked line. Victoria collected the documents with a warm smile and congratulated her on the new position. But instead of providing an office address, Victoria handed her a card with directions to a private estate outside the city. Natalie's confusion must have shown because Victoria quickly explained that their primary client preferred working from his secure residence. It was unconventional, but the compensation reflected that unusual arrangement. The hidden estate. Monday morning arrived and Natalie followed the directions through winding roads into the hills where the wealthy built their fortresses. The address led to massive gates set in walls that seemed designed to keep out the entire world. She pressed the intercom and a voice instructed her to enter when the gates swung open. The driveway stretched longer than any street in her neighborhood. Gardens surrounded her that looked like they belonged in magazines. The house at the end was not a house at all but a modern palace of glass and steel perched on the hillside like a crown. A distinguished man in an expensive suit met her at the entrance. He introduced himself as Thomas Bennett and explained he managed the estate. His manner was formal but kind as he led her through rooms that seemed designed to intimidate. They passed through hallways filled with art worth fortunes until they reached a library that took her breath away. Books lined every wall and the scent of leather and knowledge filled the air. Behind a massive desk stood a man who made Natalie forget every thought in her head. Julian Hargrave was young and devastatingly handsome with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold secrets deeper than oceans. He radiated power and control. Every movement was calculated and confident. But there was something else beneath the surface. A guardedness that suggested carefully hidden vulnerabilities. He gestured for her to sit without smiling. Thomas excused himself quietly and closed the doors, leaving them alone. The silence felt heavy with unspoken questions. Julian studied her with an intensity that felt almost physical. Natalie forced herself to meet his gaze and refused to show the intimidation coursing through her veins. Finally he spoke and his voice was rich and measured. He explained that her work would involve researching diverse topics and compiling detailed reports. The subjects would change frequently and she should not expect explanations. Her job was to find answers without asking questions. He valued privacy above everything and the agreement she signed was the foundation of their relationship. People who betrayed his trust discovered consequences far worse than any legal contract could impose. As Julian spoke, Natalie realized with growing certainty that she had stepped into something far beyond a simple research position. This was not normal and Julian Hargrave was not an ordinary man. The agreement she signed so desperately now felt like chains she could not see. She looked at the powerful man across the desk and wondered what secrets he guarded so fiercely. She also wondered with a flutter she tried to ignore why his dark eyes seemed to see straight into her soul. Something had begun in that library. Something that would change everything she thought she knew about power and truth and love. Natalie sat in her new workspace and stared at the computer screen with growing confusion. Thomas had set her up in a small but luxurious office on the second floor with windows overlooking the gardens. The equipment was state-of-the-art and everything she could possibly need was already provided. But the email that arrived from Julian contained an assignment unlike anything she had expected. He wanted her to research classified military communications protocols from the 1990s and cross-reference them with current satellite tracking systems used by intelligence agencies. This was not normal research. This was not the kind of work a biology graduate should be doing. Natalie felt her stomach tighten with unease, but she remembered the contract she had signed. The money already deposited in her account that had cleared her most urgent debts. She had committed to this path and turning back now seemed impossible. She began her research and dove into databases and archived documents that she was surprised she could even access. The security clearances attached to her new credentials were far beyond what any private research assistant should possess. 3 weeks passed and the assignments grew stranger with each passing day. Julian wanted information on political figures and their private financial transactions. He requested detailed analysis of voting patterns in specific congressional districts. He asked for research on pharmaceutical companies developing experimental treatments that had never been publicly announced. Natalie compiled the reports with growing dread. She was not stupid and the pattern was becoming clear. Julian Hargrave was connected to something much larger and more dangerous than a private research firm. She started noticing other things too. Men in dark suits who arrived at odd hours and met with Julian behind closed doors. Conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked past. Thomas answering phone calls in languages she could not identify. The security around the estate was military-grade with cameras and sensors that seemed excessive for a private residence. Natalie felt like she was working inside a fortress and she was beginning to understand why such precautions might be necessary. The midnight encounter. One evening Natalie worked late trying to finish a particularly complex report on encrypted communication networks. The house was quiet and she assumed everyone had left for the night. She walked downstairs to get coffee from the kitchen and found Julian standing in the darkened hallway staring out a window at the city lights below. He looked different without his usual armor of perfect composure. His tie was loosened and his expression was haunted. For a moment he looked almost vulnerable. He turned when he heard her footsteps and something flickered in his eyes. Not anger at the interruption but something closer to relief. He asked if she was working late and his voice was softer than usual. Natalie explained about the report and Julian surprised her by offering to make the coffee himself. They stood in the kitchen while the machine hummed and the silence between them felt different than before. Less like employer and employee and more like two people sharing a moment of unexpected humanity. Julian asked about her life before this job. Not in the formal way of their previous interactions but with genuine curiosity. Natalie found herself talking about her struggles and her disappointments and her dreams that had seemed so far out of reach. Julian listened without interruption and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her something she had not expected. He said that he understood what it felt like to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. To make choices that seemed necessary but came with consequences you could not fully predict. The confession. They moved to the library and sat in chairs near the fireplace that Thomas must have lit earlier. Julian poured them both whiskey from a crystal decanter and Natalie accepted even though she rarely drank. The amber liquid burned her throat but warmed her from the inside. Julian stared into the fire and began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. He told her things she suspected he had never told anyone else. Julian explained that he was not just a wealthy businessman. He worked for a shadow organization within the government. A group that operated outside official channels and handled situations too sensitive for public knowledge. They dealt with threats to national security that could never be acknowledged. They made decisions that kept the country safe but would horrify citizens if they ever learned the truth. Julian had been recruited young because of his intelligence and his ability to operate in moral gray areas without flinching. The research he had Natalie doing was part of a larger investigation. Someone high in the government was selling classified information to foreign powers. Someone with access to the highest levels of national security. The conspiracy reached into the upper echelons of power and Julian's team was trying to identify the traitor before catastrophic damage was done. But they had to work in absolute secrecy because the person they were hunting had eyes and ears everywhere. One wrong move and the investigation would be compromised. People would die and the nation would be vulnerable. Natalie listened with her heart pounding. This was exactly the kind of situation she had feared when she signed that contract. She was involved in something dangerous and she could never walk away without consequences. But as she looked at Julian in the firelight she saw the weight he carried. The loneliness of bearing secrets that could never be shared. The isolation of living a life where trust was a luxury he could not afford. She understood suddenly why he seemed so guarded. Why his eyes held such shadows. Julian looked at her and asked if she was afraid. Natalie considered lying, but something about this moment demanded honesty. She admitted that yes, she was terrified. But she also understood why this work mattered. She could see that he was trying to protect people even if his methods existed in shadows. Julian's expression softened and he reached across the space between them to touch her hand. The contact was electric and Natalie felt something shift in the air around them. He told her she could leave if she wanted. He would honor the financial agreement and she could walk away from all of this. But his eyes pleaded for her to stay even as his words offered freedom. Natalie realized in that moment that she did not want to leave. Not because of the money or the contract, but because something was growing between them. Something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. She told him she would stay and Julian's relief was visible. His hand tightened on hers and they sat in silence as the fire crackled and the night deepened around them. The first kiss. Over the following weeks, Natalie and Julian fell into a new rhythm. The work continued and she compiled reports that helped his team track the conspiracy. But their interactions changed. Julian sought her out more often. He asked her opinion on analysis and seemed to value her insights. They had dinner together in the estate kitchen after Thomas left for the evening. They talked about books and philosophy and dreams they had both abandoned. The attraction between them was undeniable and it grew stronger with each passing day. Natalie knew she was falling for him. It was reckless and complicated and probably the worst decision she could make. But Julian made her feel alive in ways she had never experienced. He saw past her fears and insecurities to the person she wanted to become. He challenged her intellectually and respected her capabilities. And beneath his carefully controlled exterior she glimpsed a man who longed for connection. For someone who could understand the burden he carried and not turn away. One night they were working in the library reviewing surveillance footage when their hands brushed, reaching for the same document. The touch lingered longer than necessary and Natalie looked up to find Julian watching her with an intensity that stole her breath. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. But she did not move. Could not move. Their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home and falling off a cliff simultaneously. Julian's hand cupped her face with a gentleness that contradicted his usual control. Natalie melted into him and let herself feel everything she had been fighting. When they finally broke apart, Julian rested his forehead against hers. He whispered that this was dangerous. That getting involved with him put her in even more risk. Natalie smiled and told him she had stopped playing it safe the moment she walked through his door. They kissed again and this time there was no hesitation. No holding back. They were two people who had been lonely for too long, finally finding solace in each other despite the chaos surrounding them. The warning. Their relationship deepened quickly after that night. They tried to keep it professional during work hours, but the connection between them was impossible to hide. Thomas noticed but said nothing. He simply smiled knowingly and gave them privacy when he could. Natalie had never been happier despite the dangerous work and the secrets that surrounded her. Julian was brilliant and passionate and vulnerable in ways he showed only to her. She felt like she had found something rare and precious. But danger was closing in. The conspiracy Julian was investigating had roots deeper than anyone suspected. His team discovered that the traitor was someone at the very top of government. Someone with the power to destroy anyone who threatened to expose them. Julian became more tense as the investigation progressed. He worked longer hours and the shadows under his eyes grew darker. Natalie worried about him, but he assured her they were close to gathering enough evidence. Just a little longer and they could bring everything into the light. Then one morning Natalie arrived at the estate to find Julian pacing in his office with a phone pressed to his ear. His expression was darker than she had ever seen. When he ended the call he looked at her and she saw real fear in his eyes for the first time. He told her that someone had leaked information about the investigation. The traitor knew they were being hunted and was moving to eliminate anyone involved. Julian's team members were in hiding and he was trying to keep Natalie safe. But staying at the estate had become dangerous. They needed to leave immediately and go somewhere secure until this was over. Natalie felt ice flood her veins. This was real. The danger she had feared from the beginning was no longer theoretical. Someone powerful wanted Julian silenced, and she was connected to him now. She was a target simply because she had fallen in love with a man who fought battles in the shadows. Julian grabbed her hand and pulled her close. He promised he would protect her. That he would not let anything happen to her. Natalie believed him, but she also knew that some threats were beyond even his considerable power. They were about to discover just how far corruption could reach and what price truth demanded. Julian drove through the night with Natalie beside him and the city lights fading behind them. He had abandoned his usual luxury vehicles for a nondescript sedan that would not attract attention. His jaw was set in a hard line and his hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Natalie watched him in the darkness and felt her heart ache at the burden he carried. They had left the estate in such a hurry that she barely had time to grab essentials. Thomas had pressed a bag into her hands with supplies and whispered that he would handle everything at the house. His eyes held worry that terrified her more than anything else. The safe house was a cabin hidden deep in the mountains 3 hours from the city. Julian explained that only 2 people in his organization knew about this location. It was his final backup plan for situations exactly like this. The cabin was small but well equipped with security systems and supplies that could last them weeks if necessary. Julian carried their bags inside while Natalie surveyed the sparse interior. A main room with a fireplace. A tiny kitchen. 1 bedroom. The simplicity felt jarring after the luxury of the estate, but she understood the necessity. Julian immediately began checking security feeds on a laptop he had brought. His team was scattered and in hiding. 3 members had already been arrested on fabricated charges. The traitor was moving quickly to eliminate anyone who posed a threat. Julian's contacts in friendly agencies were trying to help, but the conspiracy reached so high that trust was a rare commodity. Natalie stood behind him and placed her hands on his shoulders. She felt the tension radiating through his body. He reached up to cover her hand with his own and squeezed gently. A silent acknowledgement that they were in this together now. The truth revealed. Over the next few days Julian worked tirelessly to coordinate with what remained of his team. Natalie helped him organize the evidence they had gathered. Files and recordings and financial transactions that painted a damning picture. The traitor was revealed to be Senator William Crane. A man who had served in government for 30 years and was considered above reproach. He had been selling classified information to hostile nations for over a decade. His betrayal had compromised operations and cost lives. But his position and connections made him nearly untouchable. Julian explained that bringing down someone like Crane required irrefutable evidence and careful timing. They needed to present everything to the right people simultaneously before Crane could use his influence to bury the truth. But first they had to survive long enough to make that happen. Crane had hired professionals to eliminate Julian and anyone connected to the investigation. The senator could not afford to let this information surface. His crimes would result in treason charges and he would do anything to protect himself. Natalie felt the weight of their situation pressing down on her. She had signed a contract for a research job and somehow ended up hiding in a mountain cabin with assassins hunting them. The absurdity would have been laughable if it were not so terrifying. But when she looked at Julian, she saw a man fighting for something bigger than himself. He could have walked away from this investigation. He had enough money to disappear and live comfortably anywhere in the world. But he chose to stand against corruption even when it put him in mortal danger. That kind of courage was rare and it made her love him even more. Despite the danger, they found moments of unexpected peace in the cabin. Julian taught Natalie how to use the weapons he had brought for protection. She was a surprisingly good shot once she overcame her initial nervousness. They cooked simple meals together in the tiny kitchen and talked about futures that might never exist. What they would do when this was over. Where they might go. Dreams they could finally pursue if they survived. One evening they sat before the fireplace wrapped in blankets as snow began to fall outside. Julian pulled Natalie close and she rested her head on his chest listening to his heartbeat. He told her things about his childhood. About parents who had expected perfection and a brother who had died young. About the loneliness of being groomed for power from an early age. About never feeling like he could be himself with anyone. Natalie shared her own stories of growing up without money. Of fighting for every opportunity. Of feeling invisible in a world that only noticed the wealthy and connected. Julian kissed the top of her head and whispered that she had saved him in ways she could not understand. Before her his life had been all duty and secrets and carefully maintained distance. She had reminded him what it felt like to connect with another person. To be vulnerable and trust someone completely. Natalie lifted her face to his and kissed him with all the emotion swelling in her chest. They made love slowly in the firelight with the world outside forgotten. In that moment nothing existed but the two of them. Two souls who had found each other against impossible odds. The plan. A week into hiding, Julian received an encrypted message from his most trusted contact. A deputy director in the intelligence community who had been quietly supporting their investigation. The director had convinced several key officials to review the evidence if Julian could deliver it in person. But it had to happen quickly before Crane realized what was coming. They had a narrow window of 48 hours. Julian would need to leave the safety of the cabin and travel to a secure government facility. The risk was enormous, but it was their only chance. Natalie insisted on going with him, but Julian refused. He could not bear the thought of putting her in more danger. She was safer staying hidden in the cabin until this was resolved. But Natalie would not accept being left behind. She reminded him that she had signed that contract. She had chosen to stay even when he offered her an out. She was part of this now, whether he liked it or not. They argued for hours until finally Julian relented. He knew she was right. They had become a team and splitting up now felt wrong. They would face whatever came together. They spent the night preparing. Julian reviewed every detail of the plan multiple times. They would drive separately to the facility, taking different routes. If one of them was intercepted, the other could still complete the mission. Natalie memorized backup protocols and emergency contacts. She practiced with the weapon Julian insisted she carry. The weight of it felt wrong in her hands, but she understood its necessity. Tomorrow everything would be decided. Either they would expose Crane and end this nightmare, or they would fail and likely die in the attempt. The final confrontation. They left the cabin before dawn and Julian kissed Natalie like it might be the last time. He made her promise that if anything went wrong she would run and not look back. Natalie agreed, even though she knew it was a lie. She would not abandon him no matter what happened. They took separate vehicles and Natalie followed her route through back roads and small towns. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel and her heart raced with fear and adrenaline. Every car that passed felt like a potential threat. She was an hour from the facility when she noticed the black SUV following her. It had been behind her for the last 20 miles, maintaining a consistent distance. Natalie's blood turned to ice. She called Julian on the secure phone and told him she thought she had been spotted. Julian's voice was tight with controlled panic. He told her to stay calm and keep driving. He was sending backup to intercept, but she needed to buy time. Natalie pressed harder on the accelerator and the SUV matched her speed. The vehicle suddenly surged forward and rammed into her rear bumper. Natalie's car spun and she fought to maintain control. The road was narrow and winding through dense forest. Another impact sent her careening toward the shoulder. She remembered Julian's training and did not panic. She steered into the skid and regained control. But the SUV was relentless. These were professionals and they intended to force her off the road. Natalie saw a turnoff ahead and made a split-second decision. She slammed on her brakes and wrenched the wheel hard. Her car skidded onto a dirt road and plunged into the forest. The SUV followed, but the narrow path slowed their larger vehicle. Natalie drove recklessly through trees and over rough terrain. Branches scraped the sides of her car and the suspension protested violently. She had no idea where this road led, but anywhere was better than stopping. Then she saw it ahead. A ranger station with several vehicles parked outside. Witnesses and potential help. She aimed straight for it and did not slow down. The resolution. Natalie crashed through the station entrance with the SUV right behind her. She stumbled out of her damaged car screaming for help. Rangers rushed out in confusion and the SUV screeched to a halt. The men inside could not complete their mission with witnesses present. They reversed rapidly and disappeared back into the forest. Natalie collapsed to her knees, shaking with adrenaline and terror. A ranger helped her inside while another called the authorities. She managed to contact Julian and tell him she was safe. His relief was palpable even through the phone connection. Julian reached the government facility without incident and delivered the evidence to the deputy director. The officials reviewed everything and their faces grew grim as they understood the scope of Crane's betrayal. Arrest warrants were issued immediately. Federal agents moved on Crane's home and offices simultaneously. The senator was taken into custody while trying to flee the country. His network of accomplices was rounded up over the following days. The evidence Julian provided was overwhelming and irrefutable. The story broke in the media like a bomb. A respected senator revealed as a traitor who had sold out his country for personal gain. The scandal dominated headlines for weeks. Julian's role in the investigation was kept classified, but certain people in government knew the truth. He was quietly thanked and then encouraged to disappear from public view. The kind of work he did required anonymity, and the publicity surrounding Crane's arrest had compromised that. Julian understood. He had expected this outcome. New beginnings. Natalie and Julian left the country 3 months later. They traveled to a small coastal town in Europe where nobody knew their names or their story. Julian had enough money to live comfortably without working, and Natalie was content to leave her old life behind. The danger had passed, but they both understood that some battles left permanent scars. They bought a villa overlooking the ocean and filled it with books and laughter and the quiet joy of simply being together. Natalie sometimes thought about the desperate woman who had signed that contract so many months ago. That version of herself felt like a different person entirely. She had been looking for financial security and instead found something far more valuable. She found purpose and courage and a love that had been tested by fire. Julian was different too. The shadows in his eyes had lightened and he smiled more easily now. He was learning to live without the constant weight of secrets and duty. They married in a simple ceremony on the beach with only 2 witnesses. Thomas flew out to attend and his eyes were suspiciously bright as he watched them exchange vows. Julian had offered to release him from service, but Thomas insisted on staying. He said that someone needed to keep them out of trouble. They all laughed because it was probably true. That evening they sat on their terrace watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Julian held Natalie's hand and told her that signing that contract was the best decision he had ever made. Natalie agreed, though not for the reasons he meant. The contract had brought them together, but it was the choices they made afterward that truly mattered. They had faced impossible odds and survived. They had chosen love even when it was dangerous. They had fought for truth when staying silent would have been safer. Those decisions defined them far more than any document they had signed. The contract had been the beginning, but their love was the story that would endure. Together they had found something rare in this world. A connection forged in darkness that shone brighter for having survived it. And as the stars emerged overhead, they knew that whatever future awaited them, they would face it together. Always. The end.